Good afternoon. How is everyone doing today? First session after lunch. We're going to keep you on your toes. I'm Joshua Feinberg from SP Home Run. We work with CEOs of colocation providers, MSPs, cloud services, and hosting companies to help them identify revenue growth opportunities that they're currently missing. We're based in West Palm Beach, Florida, and work with companies all over the US. And I want to welcome you to 10 ways for colocation providers to find the right niches and avoid commoditization. And I got a chance to speak with a few of you before we got started, but I just want to get a pulse on the room. How many of you are from companies where colocation is a main part of your business model? Can I see a big show of hands? So about half of you. And then how many of you partner with or sell to colocation providers? What other group have I missed? I talked to somebody from the REIT space. I talked to somebody from the power space. Any other big groups of if you don't fit into one of those? Yes? Wholesale colo? No. Just wholesale in general. Any other groups? Anyone else I missed? Okay. I want to get a pulse also for the size of your companies, because that will dictate many times how the roles unfold, how many different hats you wear. How many of you are from relatively small companies with just 1 to 10 employees? How many of you are from companies with 11 to 50 employees? More hands. How many of you are from companies with 51 to 200 employees? 200 to 500? And more enterprisey, 500 plus. Okay, so pretty evenly split. And the one final question that I'm curious about is how many of you have a dedicated product team, product managers, product marketers, that work with customers? And how many of you personally tend to wear that hat among your other responsibilities? So pretty evenly split. This session is being recorded. Penn and AFCOM just want to make sure that you know that. This session will be 100% vendor neutral. Although I am a big baseball fan, I do not pitch well, and you will not be pitched at any point whatsoever in the session. If anything gets even remotely in that territory, I encourage you to jump up and stop. Very important to me that you got a great experience out of this session. Please make sure at the end of today's session that you rate this on the Data Center World Hosting Con mobile app. If for some reason you're unable to give this the highest possible rating, please come see me personally so we can make sure that we get your questions and concerns addressed. So we asked how many of you are from a colocation provider, seller, partner with. I'm curious one more time about roles. How many of you would consider yourself kind of in the company leadership, in the C-suite or management? How many of you do something related to sales, business development, or channel growth? How about product or engineering? Marketing? Any other broad categories that I missed that doesn't fall into any of these buckets? So it's kind of like, did you ever go to a webinar where they put the polling questions up there on the screen so they can get a pulse? This is kind of what we're trying to do. We talked about size. And finally, I'm curious how, did any of you get to attend my session yesterday on LinkedIn social selling? Or any of you heard me speak before, webinars, ebooks? How many of you are completely new to this kind of content? Great. So the first thing we're going to talk about today is why there's a convergence going on between colocation and managed services. And it was very interesting in the conversations that I had with a few of you before we got started. A couple of you specifically mentioned that not only do you provide colocation, but you also provide managed services. And there's definitely a paradigm shift that's going on and a lot of blurring of the lines that are happening between what is public cloud, what does private cloud provider mean, what does it mean to be a hosting provider, what does it mean to be an MSP, what does it mean to be a colocation provider. And in larger companies where there's deep benches of product talent, they talk about these strategy ideas all the time. In smaller companies, if you haven't thought through some of these things, some of the things we're going to be talking about today may be a little new, but there's definitely a paradigm shift going on as the market matures, as there's a lot more M&A activity going on, as things are consolidating. So the first thing I want to talk about is the idea of providing managed services, but not necessarily classifying yourself as a MSP from a business model perspective. If you think about where the managed services space was 15, 20 years ago, before it was even called managed services. Back then there were VARs, integrators, computer resellers, whole industry, and that kind of evolved into managed services. A lot of things were coming together with remote access, server log monitoring. People were running around trying to make sure that things didn't come crashing down from the ceiling with Y2K. And this was kind of the golden age of Novell NetWare, the kind of golden age of Microsoft back office and small business server. Fast forward about 10 years, and it's still largely outsourced IT for small and medium-sized businesses predominated the conversation on managed services, but things had changed. When the economy head south, when the bubble burst in 2007, 2008, a lot of the refresh cycles changed. But around the same time that this was happening, mobile devices were getting a lot bigger, even in companies of all sizes. So mobile device management became bigger, remote monitoring and management was large. Google Apps was starting to gain some traction. Microsoft was starting to pay a little bit of attention to what was going on with that, with cloud-based applications. AWS was starting to be something that people were paying a little bit more attention to. Salesforce cloud-based applications. A lot of these things were in the early stages, early adopters were just about to come into play, but a lot of the gravy train, a lot of the revenue that the managed service space was deriving from hardware refresh was starting to slow down. People were holding on to PCs a lot longer. But back then, managed services and co-location, if you even were looking at co-location back at that time, would have been totally, completely separate business models. Where are we today? If we look at small managed service providers and small co-location providers, it's strange, but there tends to be some common things going on. You got SMB clients that are demanding, they need hosting of some sort, they need cloud services, whether it's private, public, or hybrid, co-location solution. Some managed service providers are buying wholesale co-location and reselling it to their customers, but they see there's something out there that needs to be managed. We better manage it or somebody else is going to do it. Managed service providers also, a lot of their value proposition is about explaining to the local community, explaining to the local marketplace that we have awesome people. We have the best people, and that's the reason you should hire us. Oh yeah, and by the way, we also have great prices. The co-location CEO and smaller co-location providers at least are saying a lot of the same things. A lot of the CEOs of co-location providers are attracted to the SMB market because they see a quicker sales cycle compared to enterprise or compared to selling to government, but they also see the need for, they also see the ability to sell a lot more professional services, and that's appealing to them. The challenge though is that a lot of small co-location providers want to partner with managed service providers. And managed service providers tend to be a bunch that worries a lot about things like account control and account encroachment and channel conflict. So the challenge for co-location providers that want to partner with managed service providers is how do you build that trust? Even smaller co-location providers tend to be a little bit more sophisticated in their marketing and sales than smaller managed service providers, but they have a lot of that same attitude. We either need to manage that or somebody else is going to do it, and we have great people and we're going to have the best price in town. In a lot of ways, colo is the new MSP. A lot of the co-location providers, at least in the small local ones, and a lot of the small managed service providers are actively going after the same small and mid-sized businesses in their local marketplace. So if you're trying to build a channel program for your co-location company that appeals to managed service providers, this is a tall hill to climb. Being able to have a clear line in the sand of what's premise-based, what's off-premise, and being able to build the trust to be able to do that. And these aren't easy decisions. A lot of it comes down to your team, your strategy, your focus, and which kind of brings us to the next big point. How many of you have ever had conversations internally about product market fit? Product market fit is something that largely started in the SaaS world. And it's something that a lot of VCs spend a lot of time talking about, seeing whether a company is worth funding. So one of the things to think through if you're trying to find the right niches and avoid being commoditized is exactly who it is are going to be your best clients, what value you provide to them, and what quantities of products and services will they purchase from you. So we'd asked before, just to get an idea, it seemed like most of you don't have the luxury of having a deep bench of talent on your product team, so in many cases this is going to fall on someone else's shoulders. Sometimes in a small company, it falls right on a CEO's shoulders or COO's shoulders. Sometimes in smaller companies, sales takes it up. Sometimes head of engineering will take it up, but someone inevitably should be worried about whether they're really thinking through exactly who the ideal clients are for you and what are they purchasing and why. So product market fit, you may want to take a picture of the slide. It's also obviously available in the mobile app, is the degree to which your product or services satisfies demand at scale, strong market demand. And again, this has roots in the venture capital world. So how does a co-location provider know if they have product market fit? There's two basic criteria. Do you know exactly who your ideal clients are? Do you know who your buyer personas are? And do you have a really good handle on what the metrics look like for each buyer persona. Just a quick definition, a buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of an ideal client based on research and educated speculation. It's a lot more than just demographics. It's understanding what is keeping that person up at 2 o'clock in the morning worried about IT. It's understanding their goals. It's understanding their pain. It's understanding their challenges. Where they hang out online, where they hang out offline. Do they go to conferences like this? What groups are they on LinkedIn? Are they on Twitter? Are they on Facebook? What are they doing? What are they specifically worried about? And when you start to see consensus with that, it becomes a lot easier to figure out what your product roadmap should look like. It becomes a lot easier to come up with content that really resonates with those folks. It becomes a lot easier to know where to prioritize your promotional efforts, and it keeps your sales team from spinning their wheels. How many of you that work in sales or have friends that work in sales have ever kind of looked at what's in the pipeline and said like, wow, I have no idea what direction to go in? Having buyer personas that you can put in front of your sales team make it a lot easier for them to recognize a good fit client so they don't waste time on pursuits of things that just don't make sense for the business model. Because sometimes they may close a client that may be a bad fit for your company, that may end up having a major expectations management problem, may be unprofitable, and may be a client that never should have gotten through the door in the first place. So buyer personas help to crystallize that. It aligns things and gets everyone on the same page. In order to really have product market fit, we have to have an idea of who our primary buyer persona is, who we care the most about attracting, a secondary, and for a small team, you shouldn't have more than 3 or 4 out of the gate. You also may want to have negative buyer personas. If there's certain kinds of clients that you've worked with who've been like miserable to work with, and you have a crystal clear definition of what they look like, you also can do things to put them in a separate bucket to disqualify them before you invest a lot of resources in the wrong fit. So again, a buyer persona is a semi-fictional representation of one of your ideal clients based on real data and some educated speculation, demographics, behavior patterns, motivations, and goals. The problem is if you skip this, everything tends to be very bland, vanilla. It doesn't tend to resonate. So what are some of the key metrics that we should be looking at for each buyer persona? Well, the first thing is we want to understand what that client is worth to your business. At the most basic level, we call this average client lifetime value, sometimes abbreviated as LTV. This is the aggregate of what a client is worth over the lifetime of them working with you. How many of you are in co-location businesses that are based heavily on monthly recurring revenue? How many of you are in businesses where repeat sales are important? It's really, really critical that we have a good handle on what that average deal size is. Do they sign on for a 1-year agreement, 3 years, 5 years? What are the typical terms that someone buys on? We need to have a really good understanding of that. The second thing we need to understand is how much we can afford to invest in acquiring an ideal client. We call that the cost of client acquisition, or COCA. Not like Coca-Cola, but just an easy way to remember it, Coca. The reason that that's really important is if your clients aren't worth that much, you can't afford to invest very much in marketing and sales to acquire them. So in a lot of cases, when people come to us and they ask for advice on what direction to go in, the first thing we do is kind of size up their business model, how healthy their business model is, what the revenue per client looks like, do they have strong margins. These are all really, really important drivers. Think about it at one extreme. If you have a hosting business where you're selling $5 a month hosting, how much can you really afford to invest in that person, even if you think they're going to stick for 60 months? You know, the value of that client is $300. It's possible that there could be good upsell and cross-sell opportunities, but there's an upper limit on what you can afford to invest. Conversely, if you're selling enterprise co-location at $5,000 a month and you think they're going to stick for 60 months, that's an entirely different ballgame. So a lot of it depends on what you can afford to invest. Is very, very highly dependent on who your target clients are, your value proposition to them, and what the average deal size and ultimate value is. We also need to understand your average sales cycle length, the difference between when somebody first learns about your company and when they ultimately become a client. How many of you currently track that? If you're currently tracking it, how many of you have a sales cycle length that you can measure in a matter of weeks, where someone first learns about your company and within 4, 6, 8 weeks they become a client? How many of you have a sales cycle that's a matter of months, maybe anywhere from 3 to 6 months, 9 months, so it's in months? How many of you have sales cycles that are 12 months or longer? It's very important to get a handle on what that looks like, because a lot of times what ends up happening with new programs when you're getting them off the ground is you may give up prematurely if you don't have an idea of what your average sales cycle length is. It's similar to if a friend or family member came to you and said, I want to run a marathon. And you say, okay, well, have you run a half marathon before? Have you run a 10K? Have you run a 5K? No, I can't run around the block. So you kind of have to look at the starting point is and how realistic that goal is. Sales cycle length is kind of similar, is that if we're trying to figure out a way to scale everything that we're doing, identify profitable niches, we have to know how long it's currently taking for us to take a complete stranger and for them to monetize into a client. So one of the ways that we know whether we have product market fit or not is we take our buyer personas. Like in this example, we have a CFO Fred, we have CTO Tom, and we have compliance Connie. How many of you sell to CFOs or CTOs or compliance officers? These resonate for any of you with colocation. So once we have an idea of who these, by the way, these aren't necessarily the perfect buyer personas for you, they're just examples for illustration purposes. Once we have those buyer personas and we've segmented in that way, we need to be able to fill in those boxes. We need to know for each of those buyer personas how much they spend with our companies over their lifetime, what we're currently spending to acquire an ideal client just like that, and how long it takes for that ideal client in between when they first learn about you to when they actually sign on the dotted line for a long-term co-location agreement. And if you sell to or partner with co-location providers, it's all the same, only the names will change. Anyone grow up in the 1980s and a big fan of Bon Jovi? Okay. It's the same basic issue. It's just different buyer personas. So maybe you're selling to co-location Chris, CISO Chuck, and Knock Nancy. So depends on, it doesn't matter whether you're a co-location provider or you sell to or partner with co-location providers or any other kind of IT or business model, you're going to have your preferred buyer persona that you want to attract. It may be an influencer, it may be a decision maker, but there should be somebody that has extreme high economic value to your company where you're really, really focusing your efforts. Once you know that, we want to be obsessive about collecting that information so we know what their lifetime value is to us, so we have a good grasp on what we can afford to invest to acquire a client like that, and we know how long to expect. And we're going to come back to this towards the end of talk. But one of the things that we hear frequently is we're going back to the drawing board. Our traditional sales model, rethinking everything, our traditional sales model and our sales process has no longer been effective. This actually was told to me by a data center executive just a few weeks ago. Their quote was heavily edited to protect their confidentiality. And there's a lot of disruptive things that are going on in the IT space on many, many different levels. Cloud, mobile devices, cybersecurity, there's a lot of business model changes that are going on as well. But in many ways, what we're talking about here is the way that people research and make purchase decisions for co-location has changed drastically, and that was the frustration this particular person mentioned. So how do we get in front of the ideal clients that we want to reach for co-location providers? What do you use right now? What's been most effective? So if we think about where the buyer's journey was, let's roll back the clock 10 years ago to around 2007. Back then, direct mail was really powerful. People were advertising still in print journals. Your sales team made a lot of cold calls, and they sent a lot of cold emails to people that didn't necessarily want those emails. Back then, sales controlled access to a lot of the information. So if you were looking to buy data center related services, co-location related services, you didn't have much of a choice. You had to talk to sales early on. However, there was a big thing that changed in 2007 that started to fuel a whole bunch of growth in a lot of different business models outside of the IT space. Anyone have any idea what was a big seminal event that changed in 2007, and what are all those people doing? They're lined up. Oh, guess? iPhone, yep, it all changed with the iPhone, and I think I probably gave that away. No, I didn't give that away on the slide, but it's an excellent, excellent perceptive guess. And I personally, regardless of how you feel about the iPhone, and whether you're whether you're very loyal to Apple, whether you're very loyal to Google, to Android, it was a very seminal event that happened in 2007, because that's around the same time that people realized that they were getting fed up with getting interrupted by commercials. They started to pay for Netflix and Hulu to be able to fast forward through that. TiVo, DVRs became a lot more popular. How many of you still watch commercials on TV? How many of you fast forward through commercials on TV? It's not just TV commercials that people are trying to block out. What about radio commercials? I don't remember the year that Sirius XM launched, but there's a whole bunch of us now that pay $10, $20 a month to not have to listen to commercials anymore. There's a whole bunch of different business models that are all about scratching the itch that people don't want to be interrupted anymore. How many of you will actually answer a phone call now without looking at caller ID? There was a time 10 or 20 years ago where people actually paid extra for caller ID, and it was considered a luxury. Now it's a necessity. No one's answering the phone anymore. So this changes a lot of the business model. Where are we today? Now, back then they engaged early. It was like 10 or 20% of the way through the decision-making process. Now people do crazy amounts of research for co-location and IT services on search engines and social media. All the questions that you're asked in person at a conference like this, that you're asked in meetings with clients and prospects, that you're asked by phone. These are all very, very similar questions that people are going to Google and Siri and Bing and Alexa and Cortana and Siri, and they're asking them all day long. And they're doing so much more research that by the time they get to you, it's no longer 10 or 20% of the way through the decision-making process. It's 70%. In some cases, even more of their decision has already been made by doing self-directed research. And this is an enormous challenge for traditional legacy sales departments. They don't hold the leverage anymore. It's a lot more buyer-centric. And we expect that this is going to only become pronounced. More pronounced as things go on, and that 70% factor is going to become an even bigger deal. This buyer's journey for co-location has changed drastically, and unless you believe that there's going to be a resurgence in people reading print magazines and print newspapers and using printed phone books, and people are going to wake up saying, gee, I wish more people would cold call me today. I don't get enough spam. I wish there was more spam. Unless you actually believe that those trends are going to roll backwards, this is only going to become a bigger issue that our industry needs to contend with. So the question is your sales and marketing playbook living in the past, and are you basically inadvertently spamming people? So that's a big deal, is making sure that you get in front of the current buyer's journey and make sure that you're there early enough to be influencing their buying criteria, influencing how they look at these things, and earning a seat at the table as a trusted advisor. Another big thing we have to be mindful of to succeed in today's co-location environment is the way to evaluate your competition has changed. And if we're going to remain relevant in the future, we want to make sure that we're looking at the right data. And yeah, the kilowatts and the megawatts matter, the square footage matters, the tier rating matters to a certain degree, but if you're looking at it from a stranger's perspective that's never heard of your co-location company before, there's some more basic things that I want you to be clued into watching among your competitors. So if we're to remain relevant and select the right niches and avoid commoditization, the way we evaluate our competition has to change. So how can we evaluate, how can we analyze our competitive positioning? We looked at two baskets of co-location providers. By the way, none of these co-location providers that you're going to see up on the screen are NDA-protected clients, and the information that we're presenting is not private information. It's all available from third-party resources. It's just designed to give you kind of a framework and a lens to be able to evaluate what companies that you perceive to be your direct competitors are actually doing versus not doing. So we looked at a handful of large, emerging kind of international, national co-location providers. ByteGrid, they're in about 4 or 5 different markets, Colo Crossing, Cologix, Involta, Peak 10, and vExchange. Anyone here from any of those companies? Okay, which one?
Peak 10.
Peak 10, okay, cool. So you'll get to see how we kind of evaluated this. So we looked at some overall trends and what we found, and again, these aren't absolute numbers, just kind of look at them on a relative basis. We looked at for each of these companies who seemed to have the highest amount of traffic going to their website. This is based on data from a company that you might have heard of, Alexa, which is owned by Amazon. And the lower the number is, like a golf score, the better it is. So what we found is that Colo Crossing had more raw website visitors on a monthly basis than everyone else. ByteGrid and vExchange were kind of at the other extreme. But 2 million Alexa is nothing to sneeze at. It's usually at least a couple thousand visitors a month. So in this handful of co-location providers we looked at, nobody was doing terrible. For the last several years, Google and Microsoft, to a lesser extent, have been rather public about saying that a lot of their, and they don't share a lot of what causes websites to rank well, because they know that that will cause people to game the system. But one thing that's very widely believed is that the quantity and the quality of your inbound links matter. So this is the linking domains that we found, and Peak 10 has more linking domains than the handful of other co-location providers we looked at. Link Authority is a weighted average on what the quantity and the quality of the link look like, and an overall grade looked at kind of holistic measures across the board that support a funnel for traffic generation, for lead generation, sales acceleration, and social media participation. We also looked at what some of these companies were doing on Google AdWords, at least what we were able to see publicly. It looked like ByteGrid and Peak 10 were actively involved in Google AdWords, one for a considerably longer time than the other. They're both spending roughly the same amount, but one was getting a lot more clicks. Clicks in general, years ago people used to think were the be-all end-all. Clicks generally for your sales efforts are not inherently valuable if they don't become leads, and leads aren't inherently valuable if they don't become clients. But at least on a relative basis, it looks like ByteGrid is paying a lower cost per click than Peak Exchange, than Peak 10. The years, obviously Peak 10 has been doing this for a longer period of time. Organic clicks was also a proxy for what we thought was coming from organic traffic as opposed to referral traffic. But all this stuff shouldn't be looked at as absolutes. It just should give you an evaluation tool to be able to look more critically at what some of the companies that you perceive to be your direct competitors are actually doing versus not doing. I think it's also really clear, too, to recognize that there's direct competitors in colocation and indirect competitors. In other words, if you are a colocation provider that's doing $1 million in revenue, $2 million in revenue, $3 million in revenue, relatively small, you may run into times where you're competing against a regional or large national. And you'll see them as a competitor, but a large, like Equinix or Digital Realty or DFT, they're not necessarily going to see a colocation provider that's doing a couple million in revenue as a direct competitor to them. So in order for it to really be truly a direct competitor, it kind of has to be reciprocal. The challenge, too, is when so much of this buyer's journey is being fleshed out before they get to you, and it's a matter of intercepting them early on with helpful educational content that teaches them something valuable that answers their question. It's not just our direct and indirect competitors that we're going to bump into when we try to get on the page one of search results, whether it's organic or on a paid basis. We're also going to bump into all different kinds of business models that write about similar topics. So you may want to write about HIPAA tips that are relevant for healthcare CEOs in your local market, but your local business journal may be writing about that as well, and you may have to contend with that. There may be channel programs, there may be associations, conferences that are writing about, that are creating content around similar topics that you're going to have to outmaneuver. Another interesting thing that we looked at with these colocation providers is we looked at LinkedIn. We looked at how many employees were connected with them on LinkedIn, how many of those employees were in sales or business development roles, how many of those employees were active on LinkedIn in the last 30 days. I did a talk yesterday on LinkedIn social selling. There's a huge percentage of people that are on LinkedIn that log on once in a blue moon. So a big tip is if you're ever trying to reach somebody and you send them a message through LinkedIn and you don't hear back from them, don't assume that they're ignoring you. They just may not check LinkedIn on a regular basis. They may not have email alerting or be checking that. So just be mindful of that. But yeah, there were some small differences between there in terms of percentage of company that's in sales or business development, percentage of company that's in that's active on LinkedIn. We also looked at Glassdoor. How many of you have ever looked at Glassdoor from an employee or employer's perspective? Glassdoor is a really cool website if you're thinking of changing jobs, to think of what their current employees think of working there. So we looked at, among these 6 companies, what their ratings are, and they were very, very closely clustered together. Cologix and Volta and Peak 10 had some reviews. Obviously, Peak 10 had more. Cologix had a little more. But there was pretty strong consensus on there. But it's just another external piece of data that you can get a pulse on. If people in the colocation space or MSP space or what have you feel that their people are their biggest assets, one of the interesting things to know is how happy those people are to be working there. How many of you calculate a Net Promoter Score? NPS as part of your customer service? Okay, great. Progressive, forward-thinking companies will also frequently do this with their employees. They'll ask you, not, on the colocation side, how likely are you to recommend our colocation services to a friend? On the employee side, how likely are you to recommend working here as an employee to a friend? So another very interesting ranking signal to look like is hiring. How many of you, from a competitive analysis standpoint, look at the careers pages of some of the companies you compete with? Or look at their job listings to see what open positions they have. That's another signal. You can monitor their careers page. You can watch your LinkedIn stream. If you're connected with people that work at different companies, and there's the value of having a broad portfolio of LinkedIn connections is you see a lot of things that are happening as people change jobs and announcements, and things tend to be reshared. But also, don't just look at the job title itself, but actually read the job descriptions. And one of the interesting things that we had is we saw actually Peak 10 was looking for a marketing operations manager a few weeks ago, and it was a very, very impressive job description that would, for anyone that does digital marketing in the co-location space, They're looking for some, I don't know if they filled this or not, but a very, very impressive skill set that they're looking for that would run circles around relatively small teams. And it's very unlikely that you'd be able to have the luxury of being able to attract that skill set if you didn't have at least a handful or two of full-time very digitally savvy marketers. So again, that's another signal to look at to see what's going on in your competitive spaces. What are they doing from hiring? Not just on a marketing or sales or business development or channel side, but you can look at what they're doing on engineering, on operations, on facilities, anything that you feel is strategically important to giving you leverage in the sales process. One of the interesting things too is a lot of times local co-location providers are going up against co-location providers of different sizes. So, in a single location, the challenge, of course, from co-location is how are they going to address the questions about business continuity and backup and disaster recovery? How many of you are from co-location providers that are single locations? How many of you have partnered with other wholesale providers to be able to have a second location or more? Okay, so it's kind of a mixed bag there. What we find also is that when you look at kind of these mid-size co-location providers, and we were deciding what numbers to kind of crunch in and put some models through this presentation, there's kind of like local single location co-location providers. There's some interesting ones in the middle, and then we also, if we look at companies like Equinix and TierPoint and Digital Realty and DuPont Fabros, they have huge armies of people that take care of most of these things. Chances are the CEO isn't up at 2 o'clock in the morning worried about these exact same issues. But if you're from a company that doesn't have the resources of being like a publicly traded REIT or data center provider, these are definitely things to think about. With a lot of the smaller companies, it doesn't tend to be a huge investment in marketing and sales talent or automation. Sales process a lot of times isn't very well benchmarked. There's not a good understanding of what the deal stages look like between when somebody becomes a lead versus a marketing qualified lead, a sales qualified lead, an opportunity, being able to keep track of the net value of the funnel. And as you look to scale sales, these are all really, really important things that your competitors are doing in the space, so they have a much better idea of what their future revenue stream looks like. And among the smaller providers, they tend to have a really poor grasp of product market fit. Yes?
Good question. The third bullet point, investment in sales automation. Do you mean sales automation as in online purchasing or in the back-end CRM to track what's going on?
Most co-location providers are typically not using an e-commerce model where people are just buying on a self-service basis. If they are, it's usually because they're primarily in the web hosting business and it's a very low-ticket item. What we're talking about more is the marketing automation software, the sales, the CRM software, connecting all the dots together so you don't have 10 different systems with 10 different logins and nightmares about APIs and CSV files and lots of missed opportunities where you're sending an email to somebody and they get 3 different copies because it's in 3 different systems. So there's a lot of value in being able to pull that all together. And the sales cycle has become so fragmented with so many different touch points that it's really, really critical to be able to get a 360 view of what each person is doing, not just based on what they explicitly told you on forms that they filled out, but all the behaviors that they're exhibiting, all the blog posts that they're reading, all the videos they're watching, if they're attending webinars, if you're using something like Eventbrite for tracking, offline web, everything that you can do, SurveyMonkeys, everything you can do to pull into that timeline to get a much better idea as to what they really care about. Because, for example, if somebody lands on your website and they're reading 17 different articles about VPN encryption, well, when you talk to them, you better be prepared to talk about VPN encryption. And it becomes a lot easier to personalize the sales process so you're not using a static elevator pitch. Because in this buyer's journey where the buyer is in control and the seller is kind of subservient now, it's really, really important to add a ton of value. One of the ways you can provide value is make sure that you're personalizing and customizing that experience based on what they really care about. Tools are a big important part of that. So again, the challenge is many of the local co-location providers and managed service providers are going after a lot of similar clients. They're selling different things, but they're going after similar clients. Some of the co-location providers, sales and marketing, although it may not be as robust as their larger competitors, in many cases it runs circles around the local MSPs. Kind of almost like the bully on the playground taking the lunch money from the wimpy kid. But if you want to partner with MSPs, you got to be able to build bridges and make them feel comfortable. Otherwise, they won't compete with you. One more threat that a lot of co-location providers and cloud service providers didn't think about a year ago. How many of you are kind of following what AWS is doing with managed services? If you had said a year ago that Amazon was going to be in the managed services business and anyone would be concerned about that at all, it just wasn't even on the radar screen. But as we've seen, whether it's grocery stores, whether it's memberships, I saw some statistic about a year ago that something like 60 or 70% of upper middle class households in the US have Prime memberships. The penetration is just off the charts. So it's really, really hard. In the same way that people used to fear what was Microsoft going to do next, in a lot of ways, it'd be really, really very, very important to make sure that you're continuing to figure out ways to add value to your clients beyond what they can get from large public cloud providers. And the answer is definitely going to change over time. That's the importance of that buyer persona research. It's the importance of constantly talking with your clients and figuring out what their next big challenges are, what their next big struggles are. So the question is, with colocation, the way colocation is purchased, the way it's researched has changed so drastically. Are you keeping up, or is your company kind of living in the past? In order to really understand whether you're keeping up or living in the past, we have to get an idea as to what you're actually starting with. What do your assets look like? Because in a colocation space, in the colocation business, it could be really easy to think that it's largely about the real estate, that it's about the square footage, it's about the PUE rating, the certifications, the Uptime Institute rating, all of these things. And they do matter, but for different kinds of buyer personas, they mean different kinds of things. But what assets do you have that are helping you to attract the right strangers in the right places, in the right and they're at the right time, and most of all, in the right context? Because in a traditional model where cold calling was effective, where spamming people was effective, where direct mail was effective, where there were much fewer channels, where it was a lot easier to catch people's attention, none of this stuff mattered as much. How many of you, when you decide to purchase a new product or service, one of the first things you do is go to a search engine and type a query? How many of you have actually used a search engine in the last 24 hours for something work-related? How many of you have used social media for something work-related in the past 24 hours? Whether it's watching a YouTube video, looking at a SlideShare, asking a question on LinkedIn, tweeting something. So it's not quite as high. How many of you use any kind of artificial intelligence where you're asking questions of Google or Siri or Cortana or Alexa? These are things that are changing. And if we asked these questions 5, 6, 7 years ago, it wouldn't be quite as dominant as it is today. What's changed is the tipping points. Is if you look at even age groups and different demographics, it doesn't matter even if your primary ideal buyers that you're looking to attract are boomers. The adoption rate on search engines and social media, cloud, it's fundamentally changed the way people are making these decisions. So are you positioned or not? So one of the things we want to look at is whether your funnel is actually robust enough. If you're have assets that are attracting the right visitors for traffic generation? Do you have assets that are attracting the right kind of leads for a lead generation perspective? Do you have assets that segment those leads properly and nurture them? A lot of colocation providers' websites are basically set up in such a way that they think that the first time somebody comes to their website, they're going to take out their credit card or call up sales and immediately be ready to buy. And that's about as silly of an assumption as thinking that if I go into a car showroom this weekend to test out for headroom and legroom, that the car salesperson should assume that on my very first visit I'm going to buy. What happens if that person pushes really hard? They're going to push me away, right? The flip side is what happens when I am ready to buy if I go in there and no one's ready to help me. So it's really important that we not only know who they are and what they care about, but it's really important that we know where they are in the buyer's journey so we can personalize and contextualize our approach. Early on, people are asking questions about problems, about goals, about solving their problems, looking for answers. In the middle of the buyer's journey, they tend to look for a lot of comparison guides, buyer's guides, to help them weigh the different options. Towards the end, the decision-making process, then they're into looking at product-related information about your company. Maybe they'll sign up to take a tour. Maybe they'll sign up for a consultation, some kind of a free initial audit. But it's important to make sure that your assets are well-positioned to cover that entire funnel. Kind of the table stakes today is the website needs to be optimized, and it's not just about search optimization, it's optimizing for your buyer personas and a mobile-dominated world. How many of you look at your website to make sure that it's mobile-friendly? How many of you have looked at your website on your iPhone or Android phone recently to see how it renders there? Do you have to pinch and zoom, or is it nice and smooth? Is it responsive? It's not just about the user experience. There's a really important stakeholder that makes decisions besides users. And if Google sees that your website is not responsive, if it's not mobile friendly, it's going to largely penalize you, and it's going to favor websites that are. And it doesn't matter whether we're talking about ranking organically or whether we're buying paid through Google AdWords. Mobile experience matters a lot. There's another interesting thing that's being talked about as well with encrypting searches, where all websites will run on SSL. And that's starting to be something that a lot of companies are doing more of. We think it's going to be mainstream within a matter of 12 or 24 months, where if your website is not, even your public pages are not running on SSL, that you could be falling behind the competition that is. And that's certainly a very easy, very inexpensive thing to do, but it's something that people don't think about. They figure, well, it's not capturing sensitive information. Why would I bother encrypting the whole website? So the website's got to be optimized, having an active blog that shares educational content. It's very difficult to do content marketing if you don't have a content management system. Do any of you have websites that are still hand-coded and not on a CMS? It's a bear to keep the content fresh on a regular basis. It's a bear to delegate it to anyone else in your company. It takes a lot longer to really be able to get things out, and having fresh, active, updated content on your website is extremely important. Being on social media, kind of table stakes, and being realistic about what reach you have and don't have, and supplementing that with paid activity. Yeah, Mike is out. So being able to supplement that with paid activity is extremely important. You hear me in the back of the room okay? Okay, I'll walk around a little more. So if we're not realistic about what we have or don't have, it can be really difficult to know whether we can actually achieve that, because early on you can write fantastic blog posts, you can create fantastic ebooks, you can have a really compelling webinar, and if the right eyeballs aren't seeing that, it's kind of like if a friend opened up a fantastic restaurant. They didn't buy into a franchise. They didn't get advice from everyone. They got a great deal on the commercial real estate, but the reason they got a great deal on the lease is because it's 30 miles off the highway in the middle of nowhere, and there's no other stores in that strip mall. You wonder how long they're going to be in business if they didn't think through how they were going to get reach, how they're going to promote it. It's the same way with content. Half the battle with content isn't just creating stuff that people want to read, that educates them, that has the reaction of, wow, this is really good stuff. I've been searching for answers just like this for a while. It also and gets them to think of who are these folks, what do they do? That's what gets them to be interested in converting to a lead and allowing you to begin a relationship. So it isn't just about the content promotion. It's not just about the content creation, it's about the content promotion as well. So in a buyer-centric world, in a world where people do so much research online before they ever get to you, what can we do to make sure that we're only working with good fit clients? How many of you right now, if you looked at your client list really critically, would find a few clients that probably should be ex-clients? How many of you have clients that you're losing money on? How many of you have clients where they torture your NOC and support staff to the point where people dread picking up the phone when there's a call? It's incumbent on us that we take the efforts to build the client list with the right kind of people that we want to have on our client roster. So how do we attract the right strangers? There's a couple different levels, a couple different layers with this. How many of you ever heard of the term the HIPPO? Highest paid person's opinion, or highest paid person in the organization? Tends to be like your CEO. And a lot of times they're certain that they know exactly what to do, because they come to you and say, you know what? I know you're telling me that LinkedIn is important or YouTube might be important, but my 14-year-old daughter, she's really into WhatsApp and Snapchat. We got to be really big on WhatsApp and Snapchat, because that's where people are buying colocation. You're like, are you serious? Is our colocation buyer a 14-year-old? So it's really, really important to not allow your CEO's ego and your CEO's whim to get past the need to look and validate all this with data. So just chasing after fans, followers, likes, retweets, subscribers, it's got to focus on inputs that are going to get you the right kind of sales opportunities and get the right kinds of clients. So the HIPPO tends to care about those kinds of things. The digital marketer cares a lot about branding. They care a lot about design. They care a lot about engagement. They love media mentions when they can get their CEO quoted in the business section of their local newspaper, on a prominent blog, or on a local talk radio show. They absolutely love that. They eat that up. And they love they love to pursue analyst opinions to get them into all these analyst reports that give them third-party proof and validation. The revenue-focused CEO, on the other hand, they care about things that hit the bottom line. They care about tracking visitors. They care about tracking conversion rates. They care about tracking deal stages, average client lifetime value, what they can afford to invest in acquiring a client, and product market fit. Those in the back, can you still hear me okay? Cool. So when it comes to attracting the right strangers, how do we make sure that we don't inadvertently get a whole bunch of bad fit people hanging out on our sales funnel? How do we attract the right influencers and decision makers in the right places at the right time, and most of all in the right context? And I've said in the right context a couple times, this is extra critical to helping you find the right niches and avoid being perceived as a commodity provider. How many of you like to be called a vendor? How many of you like to bid? How many of you wake up in the morning and say, gee, wouldn't it be awesome if I had a whole bunch of RFPs, RFQs that were clogging my inbox where we're going to invest dozens or hundreds of hours and get absolutely nowhere? How many of you like to be brought in for a pitch, for the invitation to propose something? How many of you spend time or have people on your sales time begging for 15 minutes on the calendar of influencers and decision makers, begging for meetings? When you don't have leverage, when you're not perceived as a thought leader, when you're not perceived as a subject matter expert, this is what happens, is you're thrown into the vendor box. And it's a pretty lousy place to be because you don't have leverage. You can't charge prices that are in line with your value. All you end up largely attracting is price-sensitive buyers who only care about you being the cheapest. They don't care about what corners they have to cut, they just want the cheapest price. The flip side is when you're treated more like a partner, when instead of having sales engagements, you start out with consulting, diagnostic, exploratory engagements. You're paid to do a report to actually make recommendations about what they should do, as opposed to it just being a response to an RFP and a pitch. And most of all, prospects come to you and they ask for time on your calendar as opposed to the other way around. In the time I've been at Data Center World, 3 or 4 people have booked time on my calendar because of things that they've seen on our website or talks and everything like that. It is a complete game changer for the morale of your sales team and your executive team when you're positioned well enough that your blogs and your ebooks and your white papers and all these different events, people are reading them, consuming them, and saying, yeah, I got to talk to them. Let me book some time on their calendar. It's seen more as like a doctor-patient relationship as opposed to just being a technology provider or just being an IT vendor or co-location vendor. So it's important to make sure that we focus on finding good fit clients, because in a world where this buyer's journey has completely changed, we need as much leverage as possible to be successful in profitably growing our co-location business. However, if we want new revenue sources, we need new clients. If we want more new clients, we need good sales opportunities. And if we want good sales opportunities, we need good leads. So how do we reverse engineer this so we can get more highly qualified leads? The challenge for a lot of co-location providers is their websites in many cases are just glorified brochures. How many of you would characterize your existing website as not being terribly functional in the lead generation department and just basically a glorified brochure online? The challenge with a lot of these websites is even when they start to generate leads, there's typically only 1 or 2 or 3 places on the entire website where someone can raise their hand and say, I'm a hot prospect, I'm ready to talk to you. There's usually a contact us page, maybe there's a schedule a tour button, request a quote. And those are okay if you only want to appeal to people that are ready to talk to sales. But those are people that are 70 or 80, 90% baked. What about the much larger part of the market opportunity where we can get people that are really good fit buyer personas? It could be really good future clients, but they're not ready to talk to sales quite yet. How do we have lead generation content in the awareness stage where people are just beginning to research broad-based problems? That's where most co-location providers are falling down, is they just simply don't have enough places on their website where someone can raise their hand and say, yeah, that blog post was amazing, that video was awesome, that webinar was great. Yeah, I'm going to basically give you my business card for a free copy of that ebook. And that's essentially what's happening. They land on your website, they've asked a question, they find a piece of content, they're like, wow, this stuff is really good. I've been searching for something just like this for hours, for days or weeks. I can't believe I finally found it. That's reaction number 1, and that's really important because it prevents them from bouncing out. If they bounce out, there's an excellent chance that they're not coming back. They're gone. You're not going to see them again. But the problem is if they bounce out, Google knows that they've also bounced out. So that sends a really bad signal. And in the future, it's very unlikely that Google or Bing or Yahoo is going to continue to send visitors that are searching for the answer to a question like that. So we need to do everything possible to keep them on our site, and one of the best ways to do that is to provide really good, helpful educational content. Thing number 2 that we're after is when they say, wow, this is really good stuff, what else do they have to say? Who are these folks? And that's when they start to notice, oh, there's a free ebook that goes into this in a lot more detail. They click through, they go to your landing page, and you're like, yep, you know, these blogs are amazing. I got to get access to the ebook. It's free, and you know, it's all in the value of the beholder. Typically, the more valuable your buyer persona perceives your information to be, the more questions you can afford to ask. Typically, when we see really wimpy landing pages that are just asking for like first, last, and email, they're not even validating to make sure they have a company email. It's usually because one is nobody's really thinking through digital strategy, and they're not providing enough value in return. You know, somebody that's taking a tour or getting a free consultation is going to give you, that's much further along in the journey, will give you a lot more information than someone that's just downloading a one-page checklist on HIPAA tips for healthcare CFOs. So make sure that if you want to be generating highly qualified leads from your website, you think about what's in it for them. Why would they care enough that they're willing to part with their contact information for what's on the other side of their landing page? Your website should be your hardest working 24/7 sales rep, doesn't call in sick, doesn't fight with coworkers, doesn't need time off to recharge, doesn't overpromise on your capabilities. How many of you ever had people on your sales team that overpromise capabilities? They don't sacrifice pricing power for short-term gains, and they don't threaten to take their book of business elsewhere. So some of the basic lead generation requirements is there needs to be content for each buyer persona. The CFO cares about very different issues than the CTO. The director of compliance cares about very different issues than the CFO or the CTO. So we need to make sure that we have really good stuff for each of them. We also need to make sure that we have stuff that's different depending on where they are in the buyer's journey. Are they really ready to take the tour, or do they need a comparison guide on how to evaluate different co-location providers? Or is it something even earlier on where they're looking for security-related issues of how to find a good IT infrastructure partner? You also, to do this the right way, your conversion path should have a decent conversion rate, and there should be a nurturing sequence behind it, because if we know our sales cycle length and we think the average person is going to be in our sales cycle, in our sales process for 50 weeks, and we're going to send a new piece of content every week, we sure as heck better have 50 ways to keep staying relevant to them, as opposed to just nagging and begging for an appointment. From the Friends Don't Let Friends department, how many of you have companies that invest in things like Google AdWords or Facebook advertising or any kind of paid online advertising? From the Friends Don't Let Friends department, make sure that you don't do that until you have good converting landing pages and you have a good nurturing sequence behind it, because clicks are pretty expensive, especially good ones that are really highly qualified for the kind of decision makers and influencers you want to reach, and you don't want to mess around with that stuff if you don't have a lot of second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth. You need a lot of second chances to be able to get them to say, yep, I finally get it. These folks know their stuff. I'm ready for a conversation. It's important, too, that we are constantly measuring what is working and what's not. All leads are not created equal, and if you treat them as such, you tend to underinvest in certain areas and overinvest in other areas. So we got to measure the heck out of everything. But if we want to accelerate more leads into sales opportunities, it's critical that we recognize that they care about different issues and they're coming from different perspectives of how far along they are in the journey for co-location. So as I mentioned before, your deal stages may vary a little bit, but some reasonable things that people go through is they go from prospects to leads. Leads can become marketing qualified if they hit a certain, if they fill out a certain number of values, if they exhibit a certain kind of behavior. Once they're sales accepted or sales qualified, they advance. Once somebody from sales has a conversation with them, they advance them to an opportunity, project what the value of that is. These are going to vary a little bit depending on your company, but the key thing is to think these things through. It's very unlikely if you're selling co-location that's worth tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars that they're going to immediately advance from a lead to a customer within a matter of hours or within a matter of days. Yeah, every once in a while they've reached the boiling point with their colo provider and there's legitimately an emergency, but people tend to look for co-location replacement usually towards the end of their agreement or when they sense that something is headed really, really south with their current co-location providers. So we talked before about the intersection of your buyer personas and those key metrics, lifetime value, cost of acquisition, and sales cycle, but we also need another grid. We need to make sure for each of our buyer personas that we care about that we have content for each stage of that journey, that we have awareness stage content for people that are just starting to research problems, that we have consideration content for people that are weighing their different options for different co-location providers, and we have decision stage content for people that are ready to talk to sales or just about ready to talk to sales. Most co-location providers on their website are severely overweighted in the decision stage, assuming that everyone is immediately ready to talk to sales, and they're usually severely underweighted in the awareness and consideration stage. They don't have a lot of educational content on their website. So the building blocks to do this is you need buyer personas, you need premium educational content that's good enough that people will trade a business card for it. And when I say trading a business card, it's kind of metaphorical. The offline version would that be if you had like a sponsor booth down in the expo floor and your CEO wrote a book about some aspect that's especially relevant to the data center industry, and everyone that came by your booth could trade a business card for an autographed copy of the book, and that book, maybe worth $30, $40, $50. You're kind of doing the virtual version of that on your landing page with an ebook, with a white paper, with a special report, downloadable guide, webinar recording. So that's basically how people do that value change. There needs to be conversion paths to take someone from a visitor to a lead. Segmentation should be a very important part of that, not treating everyone as if they're the same. They care about different issues. Workflow automation is really key too. If somebody is looking at your content at 2 o'clock in the morning or 2 o'clock on a Sunday afternoon, and no one from your sales team is going to be able to touch them for 12 hours, for 24 hours, 36 hours, you want a way to be able to continue accelerating things. You'd be shocked, once this is set up correctly, how many first-time visitors become someone that hangs out on your website and reads 20 or 30 pieces of content and watches a whole bunch of videos and things like that just because you had it there. If you don't have that deep amount of content there's no way for them to spend that kind of time getting educated about all these issues and starting to fall in love with your content, and by extension falling in love with your company. Events are really key too, especially in the co-location space, whether you're doing webinars, whether you're doing open house events that encourage tours. This is a very, very big part of being able to advance the sales process for co-location providers. So this should be part of most of your strategy and should be very well baked into your whole digital footprint and playbook. We're not done, however, when the co-location sale is closed. New client and new partner onboarding and continuing education matters more than most realize. How many of you have a structured onboarding process for new co-location customers? The challenge is if we don't have a structured onboarding process, we're leaving it to chance that your new clients actually know how to get good value out of your services, which in many cases just isn't true. So we need a way of making sure that they understand what they've purchased, how to get access to your resources, and in a lot of cases, understanding the other products and services that you provide, but not so much from a product and service perspective, but from the pains and the challenges and the frustration that you help address. So it's important to not just focus on scaling revenue growth across net new clients, but looking at your existing client base and making sure that you're taking advantage of all those opportunities among existing clients where they already know, like, and trust you. This is called customer marketing. Having structured onboarding is a big piece of that. Teaching new clients how to get good value out of your co-location is a piece of that, and educating them about all the other things that you can, all the other problems and goals and problems and challenges you can help them address. From a co-location and managed services perspective is really important with that as well. But think about this as a whole funnel. At the top we have strangers, they discover us, they become visitors. Visitors that love our content raise their hand and say, yep, I want the ebook, I want the planning guide, I want the webinar, and they become leads. Leads, if they're qualified, can advance to become marketing qualified or sales qualified and opportunities, and a percentage of those will eventually become clients or customers depending on how you prefer to deal with that. If you're looking for channel partners, they can go through a similar funnel. It's just different buyer personas. But we're not done once they become customers. We need to take really good care of them. We don't want to worry about retention, but we also want them to become really good and brand ambassadors for our co-location so they spread positive goodwill about your company and help to bring more strangers. So the toolbox for doing this: segmentation, personalized content, surveys, as we mentioned, events before. We talked briefly about surveys and net promoter scores, and social monitoring, monitoring what they're saying about you online. How many of you monitor your Twitter feed and what clients are saying with you online? It's important to pick that stuff up. It's just another input. If they're dissatisfied, you want to nip that in the bud and take it offline as quick as possible. In a world where machine learning and AI is becoming really big, it's important that our strategy isn't just based on copycatting competitors and isn't just based on chasing the CEO's whims. So one of the most important ways to make sure that we've really thought through these issues of how we're going to identify the best niches and avoid being commoditized is to let the data tell the story. Let your best clients, your ideal buyer personas data and their buyer personas dictate those niches. How do we do that? Closed loop reporting. Closed loop reporting is all about is connecting your sales tools, your CRM, to your marketing tools. So you know exactly when you get an ideal client, what caused them to come through the door, and what are all the things they hit on their journey between when they first found out about your company and when they sign on the dotted line to become a new client. So we need to be able to tie that all together. If we don't, we have no idea what's working and what's not. Like 100 years ago, 50 years ago, people used to say, you know what, half of my marketing is working, the other half of my marketing is not, and it's a complete waste of money. The problem is I just don't know which half. There is no excuse to do anything anymore unless you can track it. Everything should be accountable, down to the click, down to the lead. If it's not, you probably don't want to do it, or you should think through the basic strategy. When you have a good handle on this, this allows you to shift from underperforming campaigns to campaigns that are doing well, where you can double, triple, and quadruple down on them, and your results will continue to improve over time until your competitors start to figure out what you're doing, and then that becomes another issue. So the building blocks to do this the right way is to make sure that you have the right talent on your team. If you have a single marketing person that's trying to wear 5 or 6 different hats, it's really, really hard to keep up. In the same way, if your sales team isn't specialized by roles, business development versus somebody that advances sales, or specialized by territory, or specialized by verticals, typically as you scale up, that specialization becomes extremely important, not only in sales and marketing, in channel. So think about your talent, think about the technology, having the right systems to be able to attract and compete effectively, and make sure you have the right strategy. If you skip any of these steps or you underinvest in them, it's going to be really, really hard to compete in the co-location business in the future. It's really maturing rapidly. The consolidation is off the charts. So where do we end up with at the bottom? Where do we end up with sales? Well, we should be able to match up our buyer personas, our CTO Tom, our CFO Fred, compliance Connie. And by the end of the journey, we not only know who our favorite buyer persona is, we know who our secondary is, but we should have a handle on their data, what their average client lifetime value looks like, how valuable they are to your company in terms of co-location and other related revenue. We should know what we are currently investing to acquire a client like that, and we should know how long it takes for them to when they first learn about us, to ultimately become a paying client, that average sales cycle length. So if you can do nothing more than today to go back to your team and start to fill out a matrix like this and know who your ideal, who your primary buyer persona is, who your secondary buyer persona is, and start to really get a handle on that data, that's going to make an enormous difference to help you focus your efforts on identifying the right niches and avoiding commoditization. 2 things kill initiatives like this more than anything else, basically living in the past. This is when your CEO or when your board is severely underinvesting time and resources in this because they truly believe that the buyer's journey still happens in print magazines and print newspapers and printed encyclopedias, and in their mind, Google and LinkedIn and mobile devices were never invested. So the CEO, there's got to be CEO buy-in, and there's got to be the right level of time and financial resources put into this. Otherwise, it's very, very difficult to compete. If any of you ever put together fantasy baseball teams or football teams, you know that people are constantly tracking stats like wins above replacement and player salaries and things like that. If you want to compete, you got to have the right team in place. So we talked about the importance of providing managed services, but not necessarily calling yourself a MSP. We talked about the importance of getting a handle on your product market fit, how critical it is that you get found early enough that you're in front of the buyer's journey. We talked about how the definition of what your competitors are doing and what you can observe about them has changed. It's not just about the megawatts or the kilowatts or the square footage or about their tier rating. There's a lot of other things that you can size up about their level of sophistication for how they identify the right niches and how they avoid commoditization. Take stock of your content assets and lack thereof. Make sure you're getting the right strangers through the door. It can be incredibly frustrating to be attracting the wrong people into your funnel and onto your client list. Make sure that you're thinking through how you're going to get leads. Make sure you're thinking through how those leads are going to advance to sales opportunities. Do not overlook your existing client base as a source of future revenue growth. And most of all, make sure that you connect the dots. So you let your best clients' data and those buyer personas dictate the niches that you pursue. I'll pause for a second. I know a couple of you are taking pictures. Please make sure if you have the mobile app installed on your phone for the Data Center World HostingCon conference that you rate the session. If for some reason you're unable to give this the highest possible rating, please come see me afterwards so I can address any remaining concerns. One more quick PSA. I share a ton of public service announcement. I share a ton of best practices and tips and tutorials on how co-location businesses can attract the right strangers, convert them to leads, accelerate revenue, differentiate, and grow and scale profitably. Please connect with me on LinkedIn if you want to be able to keep up with that in the future. There's a lot of Joshua Feinbergs, but I'm probably a second or third degree or common group membership with many of you in the room. So 3 key things that you learned during the session. We talked about analyzing the competition, why the definition of what the competition may look like may be a little different for you. We talked about how to identify market opportunities based on real data, not just hunches and gut feels. And we talked about positioning your company, your co-location company, or a company that works with co-location providers for profitable growth based on finding the right niches and avoided being reclassified as a commodity provider. So I'm so glad that you're able to join us today. If you need help finding the right niches and avoid commoditization, my contact information is up there on the screen. Feel free to take a copy of that. I'm in the app, and you can reach out with me on LinkedIn. But so glad that you're able to join us, and I hope you have a great remainder of your Data Center World HostingCon experience. And I'll stick around here for a few minutes if anyone has any other questions.